Hey everyone, intro to mats. We've already been introduced to them. Really, we've kind of played around with a few more other than the Fong, which is the default mat. But there's a few important techniques and parameters that are good to know for all of these. So I want to kind of go through some of these other mats, and then end up with the PBR. Talking about substances and texture maps. So this will be a series of a few demos exploring that question. But first, let's just get rid of this text here. Let's look at our trusty old Fong mat. We've already understood things like some of these other maps and what they do. Diffuse is just the color. Color map, things like if we just kind of throw in any old top into that, then that gets applied as a texture to that material. Beautiful. Okay. Things like with the normal, bump, height, diffuse, specular, emit, all these things might make a little more sense when we talk about PBR. So we'll cover that in a minute. Alpha channel is something that we haven't really talked about too much. Transparency in our materials. So there are some kind of wonky things that we need to be aware of when we are working with an alpha channel, especially if we want to have multiple somewhat transparent objects in front of or behind each other. And then that presents some complicated stuff involving the GPU. And some of that can be highly specific depending on what type of machine you have, a PC or Mac. So let's talk about it. So let's say I got two, let's just do, instead of this kind of globular thing I have working here, let's just do a good old circle. Okay. Oh, wait, why is that like that? I want these to be 1, 1, 1. Okay, cool. And let's see both of these things. So let's do both of those, and let's move that way a little bit. So we've got one kind of bluish circle, one, or I should say sphere, and one reddish one. So what if we want some transparency to be happening between these? So if I go into my my blue Fong here, and I go into alpha, let's see, I'll kind of set this like so. So this is actually working right now, but actually I should do it like that. I had already changed it, like whoops. So by default, this is set to sorted draw with blending. So you've already seen the answer here. So we can see we have a problem when I do this alpha situation here, because we should be able to see the red sphere kind of inside of it, right? So we need to do a couple things. One is we need to go into the common tab and we need to turn on blending transparency. And so this by itself, okay, so that worked. That's beautiful. Depending on the order of rendering of these objects, which sometimes we do not have control over, just this by itself will work. If I wanted to do this the other way, actually, let me do the same thing for the red. Let me turn on blending, and let's do, okay, let's say blue is now alpha 1, and let's try lower alpha for the red. Okay, so okay, I'm doing the exact same thing here. Blending transparency is on for both of those, right? I should be seeing the blue sphere inside here, right? But I'm not. That's because just due to the voodoo magic that's happening inside, which I don't understand, the order of rendering of these geometries is in a certain order, and the default transparency parameter for our render is a sorted draw with blending. So it's considering the order of those things. If I select this, order independent transparency, there we go. So now it doesn't matter which order these geometries are rendered. It will treat them properly. So that's what I like to see. Okay, maybe I think I liked it better when the blue one was a little bit transparent. So let's do that one. Sure. Okay, looks good. So there's also a little, you know what? But actually, the back faces, to be honest, it was more apparent on the red one here, I think. When we have created this transparency now, we not only see the front face of our geometry, we also kind of peer inside of it, and we're seeing the back face of the kind of opposite side of that sphere, if that makes sense. And you can kind of see it mostly on the edge right here. There's a kind of weird doubling up of that because we're seeing the back face also. So something else to be aware of is, oops, if we go back to the comment tab, okay, we got our blending transparency on. Let's look down here. Cull face is set to use render setting. And I'm going to try this. Ooh, look at that. So I'm now culling the back face. So I've gotten rid of the back face of the sphere. So I'm only seeing the front face. So now maybe I want to like bring this up a little bit. So now that is just making a much cleaner edge because we're not seeing that back face. You know, this little seam right here, that's, it's just a, you know, a little glitch that most likely, I'm on an iMac right now. Most likely, if we're on an NVIDIA GPU, then that would not look like that. So there's just little kind of tweaks that we can sweat over, but you know, maybe for now it's just that's the way it's going to look. And let me try also. I'll do this all the way, and then let's look at the blue one. So blue one, the back face doesn't look as apparent right now because. Oh, you know what? That's because I already had this calling the back face. That's why. So now I can kind of see, yeah, a little bit. So maybe I want to go ahead. So this is really on a as needed basis. It's just something to be aware of if you're doing some kind of transparency situation. So, okay. I kind of like that. All right, so that's good enough for the font. Let's go to constant. And maybe let's just get rid of our other geo. And maybe I'll just shrink this down a little bit. So this is not rocket science. Constant just creates a constant color. The lighting does not affect it whatsoever. So there will be no shadows, no lighting. No sense of like it being a 3D shape at all because it'll be just purely flat. So if you have very like graphic visual needs, then this is a great mat to use. Same situation happens with alpha, right? If we had these two things layered, make sure blending transparency is on alpha channel. And for that, I don't think I might be wrong, but I feel like this probably the sort of draw should work just fine because we're rendering it in a very flat way. But you can try that out just to be aware of. And then of course we've got color map, so we could do the same sort of like plopping in some other top if we wanted to have a color map onto that. Great. So one of my favorite mats is line, and actually let's look first at wireframe right here. And maybe it's a little easier if we just look at, because there's like a little bit busy with the sphere here, so we just look at a box. So for wireframe, this not a whole lot of options. I think by default it will say this kind of OpenGL tessellated wireframe. And so we can kind of see, for this we only see the front faces, but it's got this extra extra sort of diagonal line in it. And if you're on a Mac, you'll notice the line width parameter here does nothing. So like on a NVIDIA GPU, this would actually be kind of setting the thickness of that line. If I do topology, then we see both front as well as back face wireframes. So for certain geometries, that might work. But line gives us a lot more cool options. So here we can already kind of see with line, we've got, let me do this like super thick. We can differentiate between a near setting and a far setting. So right here, I'm like setting, okay, how far away is near? So we're basically like, distance from the camera in units. So this far line back here, I'm not sure how far it is, but like if it is, kind of beyond this, we're kind of dealing with these numbers right here, kind of based on whatever the distance actually is. So it looks pretty good where like this front edge right here is pretty much on the near side of things. Then this one back here is far. So I'm like setting the width of both of those. All these other settings you could play around with some more. There's just lots of other ways we kind of tween between that near and far values, like linearly or exponentially. Another cool thing, so right now I'm drawing lines, but we can draw points. Set the point color of these. Like whatever. Okay, that's pretty cool, right? Maybe we could do both of these, do lines and points. Cool. Also, you can notice here, so point type, we can have different types of things there. A sprite, so we kind of load some other image in there, which we do somewhere else around there. But a line is what I care about right now. This is good enough. We can change the type. This matters more if you have like an open-ended line. So these are all kind of closed lines in the shape, but kind of like in Adobe Illustrator, where you can set on the stroke parameter, you can set the joint type, so that can be kind of nice. And then, so right here is on the near color, far colors, where I'm kind of tweaking these settings right here. So that can be pretty cool, especially if we, start getting some sort of dynamic thing happening. All right, so these are all kind of moving around. Let me slow that down a little bit. Right, so then we get this kind of dynamically changing width and color situation. So that's pretty cool. Okay. So a cool thing we could do is start layering these on top of each other, right? So let's do, I want to add this like line mat as well as a Phong mat. So let's do, okay, I've got this Geo2 as my line. Let's actually do this kind of bluish color for that. Let me go back to my render and make sure I'm rendering everything. And I want alpha on that to be 1. And actually I need the translates to be the same though. So this one is still on 0.2. Let's go back to 0. There we go. Oh, actually, this is kind of cool. So I had forgotten, on this Phong, I still have back faces being culled. So I'm seeing the front faces, but like in these more transparent bits right here, it's actually kind of facing away from me. So I'm only seeing the back face. So it remains transparent. So that could be a kind of a cool thing to play with. I got this back. Then there we go. Okay. Looks pretty cool. Okay. So we can just imagine all these different ways we can combine, right? We use like separate geos with separate materials rendered by the same thing to make it a little bit more complex. Seeing this little edge right here. So bevel. So it's a very subtle change with this joint type, but you can see a little difference. Now it's round. So you can play around with all of those some more. Let's look at particle, some point sprite stuff. Let's go back to our sphere and let's stop that from moving around. And maybe I want to go back to just looking at Geo2. And let's get point sprite. Okay. Good. And instead of that, I want to look at my particles. Let's do select one. Okay, so now I'm looking at my particles coming in. So let's actually look a little bit at, no, not that. Our SOP network for a moment before we go back to looking at the point sprite mat. Because what's happening, because a couple of things I want to look at here. The first being thinking about normals again. So I've got this sphere, so I have already kind of turned on my normals. To do this again, kind of click there, right click, display options, and this gives us things like point numbers, point normals, point texture coordinates, which isn't really doing anything right there. It's like XYZ coordinates, which is like unreadable at that stage. But normals is good. I want to see that. And okay, that's fine. Okay, let's actually get something that has a little bit more funkiness to it. Okay, just to kind of show this. So actually, you know what? Let's go back really quick to 0. And I want to get a Fong first before I talk about this stuff. Alpha all the way, and let's shrink this down. Just so we can see this a little bit better. Okay. Okay, so that's off. Okay, gotcha. So what we're looking at right here, by default with any noise SOP, attribute point position, so we are randomizing the XYZ coordinate of that actual position. And we can see that right here. But we are not also changing the direction of the normals. So the normals are still coming out of each point, but they're still facing in exactly the same direction as they were before in our very like highly normalized sphere right here, which is a problem because the normals determine how, when a light shines at that point, how it reflects and then bounces towards the camera. And so if the point, is kind of moving around like this, that will affect how the light should reflect from it. And the normals are not actually kind of working together with the topology of the geometry here, which will lead to a kind of fake looking lighting situation, which is that right there. But if we add a attribute create SOP, we can compute normals, and watch what happens when I do this. There we go. So now all of a sudden this looks like a realistic, the light is bouncing off of this in a realistic way. And we can see right here that the normals directions is totally different because it's responding to the exact curvature of every single point on that geometry. So that's something to be aware of as we talk about these demos of building towards a PBR material system texture maps that look maybe more realistic. So this is really important to understand how normals work in order to create a more realistic texture and lighting situation. So that's one trick that we did. And then also what we're doing, if I look down here, let me switch back to my particles, which is like, you can barely see it right here. Let me get back to point sprite. There we go. So we can kind of see them here. So one thing I'm using right now is a sort, and I'm randomizing those points. So let's just do this. Let me do no change. And if I look at this right here, display options, we can look at point. Oh wait, no change. Actually, you know what? Let me, because that looks like the points are still kind of shaken up somehow. So let's look back here maybe. Display options, get rid of normals. Okay, yeah, there we go. Can kind of see that now. All right. Let me make this less funky. Okay. So we can see by default, the points are kind of in order. So this is 0.247 and then 0.248 and then 0.249, 0.250. So it's kind of going in this order like that in a highly regular way. And when we do that, so my sort, let me just, for visual purpose, let me bypass that. So we can see when we go into a particle SOP, the particles are being emitted first from 0.0 and then 0.1 and then 0.2, right? So it kind of has this almost like a scanning situation, but maybe I don't want that. I want it kind of like to appear like it's coming from all over the place all at once. So if we do a sort SOP and then randomize, so yeah, right now you can kind of see right there. So 0.267, 278, 5, so it's all kind of mixed around, right? And from our particles, we can see it's still emitted from 0.0 and then 0.1 and then 0.2 and then 0.3, but those points are just kind of randomized all over the surface of the geometry, so it has this kind of nicer cosmic effect to it. Okay, great. So in my particle system, so by default, usually particle type is render as lines. So we can kind of see there's little tiny lines that are coming out. You know, one other little trick, the speed of these, the speed at which the particles are emitted is dependent on the normal length. I can play with that normal length. I can modify it with a point SOP. So let's look at the normals one more time. Okay, so I see the normals right there. So this determines the direction and the speed with which the particles are emitted from each point. If I go into here in my point SOP, so keep normal, let's add normal. And I see this little thing, so meta input normal for X, Y, and Z. What if I did something like this? Times 2. You kind of see they're getting twice as long now. And when I did that, the particles are now being emitted twice as fast from those points. And depending on your settings here, they should travel twice as far, depending on what the birth and decay rate is. Or, you know, if I want to do something kind of a slower thing, right? So there's just very slowly popping out of there. So point SOP allows us to get right in and modify some parameters of individual points. I shouldn't say parameters, they are attributes, I guess is the technical term. But also, okay, so now these are super tiny. I want to make these kind of bigger, more interesting. If I look back at my point sprites, so I finally get into our point sprite mat here. I've got color map. So constant point scale, attenuate point scale are two really cool things. So let's like boost this up. And let's do, oh wait. So I'm like changing this. I'm like, oh, why aren't these getting bigger? It's because in my particle SOP, I still have these rendering as lines. I need to render as point sprites. There you go. Okay. And we can see right here. So I'm changing the shape of these, the size. So by default, a point sprite is a square. I could do attenuate point scale. And now that is going to let me, kind of in the same way that the line mat has, I can define what a near distance and a far distance. And so near distance, far distance, that's like way too much. So near should be 20, far should be very tiny. So let's see. I don't know, what if that was like... So this is really just dialing in. Okay, so that's, now I'm seeing a little bit of a difference. Okay. Right, so the ones that are a little bit closer get bigger. Okay, that's looking kind of cool. Okay. But I don't want these like stupid like squares, right? Cool thing to use here would be a color map. So let's try a little ramp. Let's do a little, was it radial? No, I went circular. And okay, let's do an alpha thing here. So let's do, okay, white would be all the way alpha, and we don't want to repeat, so just hold it. No, 0, that's what I want. And let's make this look kind of nice. Let's do like, I don't know, like a reddish, pinkish something. Oh, whoops, I kind of, there we go. Okay, that's what I meant to do. And let's make that kind of like yellowish, I guess. Okay. So, looking good. Let's put that on color map. And there we go. So now we have this color map on each of my particles. So maybe I need a little boost here. So let's do. So there we just have to kind of play again with the right thing. Actually, let me make this really big so we can see a little more clearly that there is some weird blending stuff happening again. So we can kind of see I've got my alpha channel in my color map, but it appears to be overlapping, right? It's kind of cutting off the point sprites that are underneath it. So yet again, we need to go into here. And that is still not working. So sometimes, so again, this is frustrating on a Mac because I think typically on a PC that is all that is needed to make this work properly. But let me try, there we go, depth test also. There we go. So right now it's still testing because each of these particles exist in that 3D space. So some of them are in front of the other ones. And this is doing a depth test, which is occluding anything that's behind. But if we don't do a depth test, then... Okay, right. So we need both. Blending transparency is on, depth test is off, and then we have a nice little overlaying particles there. And then we could play around with some other things here, like this. This gets into some other little details that you can play with. But in general, I think that's a cool thing to do. You could do even like movie file in. Oh, okay, yes, I'm going to do the banana because I have to. Bring the banana right there. Okay, beautiful. So the banana looks distorted though. So I think this needs to be a square. So what I might do is, we could do like a fit, something like that. Okay, that's looking good. All right, great. So that's good for this first video. I think PBR deserves a whole thing on its own. So, all right, thanks.